सुप्रीमकोर्ट प्रधान विचारपति जस्टिस डीवाई चंद्रचूड़ कटक जुडिशियल एकाडेमी रे चलीथिबा नेशनल कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑन डिजिटाइजेशन पेपरलेस कोर्ट सम्मेलन रे जोग दैछंती। ई सम्मेलन रे देशर विभिन्न हाईकोर्ट विचारपति जोग दैछंती।
On cybersecurity, I have constituted a committee. Most of the committees which I constituted during the pandemic, for instance, I constituted a committee on live streaming rules. I constituted a committee on preparing e-filing rules. We constituted a committee on an SOP for digitization. The committee on SOP for digitization was obviated by one basic aspect, namely, what happens if the technology which we adopt today becomes obsolescent? At least I grew up. Many of the young judges here may not have grown up in the same age in which I grew up, but I grew up in an area when you had these records, the long playing and the short playing records. They gave way to your cassettes with the spools, then the smaller cassettes, then the CDs. I still have a CD player, but it is absolutely redundant because nobody plays CDs anymore. What happens if the same thing happens to our digitized record? How do we ensure that this huge outlay of public funds does not become redundant? And therefore, we constituted a committee on SOP for an SOP on digitization, of which Mr. Katre from CDAC, who's going to speak to you, was a very integral part. All these committees have done their work, but there's one committee which is still doing its work. And that's the committee which is chaired by Justice Rajiv Shakdar. Many of the others were also chaired by him. One of the committees is the Committee on Cybersecurity and Data Security and Privacy. And naturally, that committee is taking time because that is the most difficult part of our work. How do we ensure data security? And how do we ensure data privacy? We have opened up our APIs, our application programming interfaces, to all government departments as step one. Recently, we shared our APIs with a governmental agency. Before we realized that government agency had put up the APIs across India for public consumption, we had to scramble and request them to pull back the APIs from the public domain because we said, look, we can't put these APIs for public consumption across India for the reason that this deals with very sensitive data of individuals, marital problems, child sexual abuse, gender violence, commercial confidences. So we are in the process of evolving a national model for data security and privacy. And the moment that is done, I think we would have achieved a very major step. On digitization, I want to highlight a few key areas. First, digitization of court records. I've already spoken about the digitization SOP. The next, which is a very important aspect of phase 3, which is establishing a judicial data preservation software, which we would need to establish for data security. The next, catering born digital data, because now what will happen is in phase 3, a lot of our data would be born digital. We would not be scanning data which was either in the paper form or scanning something which was e-filed, but it will be born digital data. So how do we cater to the born digital data? And then finally, moving towards and enabling a paperless court. In the next slide, I've already referred to the e-Seva Kendras. We also need to have a robust e-filing platform. We are now on the anvil of e-filing 4.0. Video conferencing, which I've already spoken of. There's an area which I would like to refer to on video conferencing. The Parliamentary Standing Committee on the Department of Justice visited the Supreme Court on 2 occasions. It was in fact not a part of conventional protocol for the Supreme Court to engage with the Parliamentary Standing Committee. But I got a request from Mr. Sushil Modi, who chairs the Parliamentary Standing Committee, and he very graciously asked me as to whether the Supreme Court E-Committee would be willing to engage with the Parliamentary Standing Committee. I consulted Chief Justice Ramana, who was my Chief Justice, and he said, brother, if you have no problem, I have no difficulty. And I engaged with a host of members of Parliament across political lines. And I can share with you that there was just a sense of awe at the work which has been done by the Indian judiciary, particularly in the ICT area through the pandemic. And part of the reason why we were able to sustain the budget which we had planned is because of the robust support which we got from the Parliamentary Standing Committee. Thereafter, the same parliamentary standing committee came to engage with the Supreme Court in its activities with NALSA, which is chaired by Justice Sanjay Kishan Kaul. Now, one very important part which the parliamentary standing committee made before us was this. They said that when we visited various high courts, we found that so much of the technology infrastructure which has been set up is obsolete in the sense it's not being used by the high courts at all. Screens, the computers are just put away in a portion of the court as a sort of a reminder that we use technology at some point.
हम सीधासख चित्र देखुले कटक जुडिशियल एकाडेमी चली नेशनल कॉन्फ्रेंस ऑन डिजिटाइजेशन पेपरलेस कोर्ट सम्मेलन सीधा चित्र रही।